Hello and good evening to our Bible study for today, June 30th of 2020. And today we're going to take a look at one of the largest prophet books that the Old Testament has, which is the prophet of Isaiah. Again, to start out with, we've been talking about the prophets during this entire month of June. What is a prophet, especially in the context of the Old Testament? A prophet is someone who has contact with the divine or is a spokesperson for God. We have different types of prophets in the Old Testament. Usually prophets that are employed in a temple, like Nahum, temple priests, and they get a vision. We have prophets that are in service to a king, like Nathan, for King David. We have prophets that belong to an order of prophecy that then create successors and predecessors, like Elijah. And we have free prophets. Those are usually the biggest group, and those are the ones that are often in opposition to kings and governments. Most of the prophets in the Old Testament are free prophets. Usually people that have been recruited by God at some point in their life and then started prophesying for God. Today about the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah is very difficult to distinguish. This is because it's a very large book. It has a total of 66 chapters and it's really long. And what we know is that there are two breaks within the book. And those breaks are not just content-wise, but also from the language, from the style of prophecy, and so on. So what mostly we as theologians distinguish is that there are three prophets of Isaiah, that this book of the prophet Isaiah has been written in three different parts. And every single time a prophet named Isaiah or somebody claiming to be the prophet Isaiah shows up at different times in history. There is a break between chapters 39 and 40 and between 55 and 56. The only conclusion that we can draw is that we have three different parts that were written at three different times in the ancient history. And when I go through these three different parts, I'm also going to make clear when that time frame is and how can we even distinguish that it's probably during this time frame. But it's something to keep in mind that this book of the prophet Isaiah has been growing gradually over a long period of time and has been redacted by at least two other people with more content. That is what makes the prophet Isaiah difficult to distinguish. Not only because of the length, but also of this redaction, since it has been growing over such a long period of time. It makes it also harder to understand in contrast to the prophet Ezekiel or Hosea that we looked at the last couple of times, since they have all been written in a very short amount of time, usually. So what we distinguish is usually between 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. So it's really a three split of the book. So the first Isaiah, the book of the prophet of 1st Isaiah, ranges from chapters 1 to 39. It is the longest part and it's also the oldest part. What we can say about the time frame is that it was probably written between 736 to 700 before Christ in the time frame. That is what makes Isaiah one of the first prophets in the Southern Kingdom. We can pretty much pinpoint the location to Jerusalem. But with that, we know he is one of the first prophets to ever come out, which makes him a very important one. I'm going to see later why he is important on a second scale as well. What we have in the first with the first Isaiah is mainly words of accusation. This is nothing new if you listen into the other prophets. It's usually always the same. Critics, they criticize the social policy, sometimes foreign policy, a lot of times religious cultus, and how religion was practiced. And it's no different here. The main words of accusation that we have are against Jerusalem, against Judah, and against other people around. The main part, however, is words against Jerusalem, which we then use to deduce that probably Isaiah was prophesying in Jerusalem since he spent so much time about the city. I'm going to go through very quickly through a couple of these points. Critique on foreign policy. The king, and this is one of the main problems that the prophets have. The kings were doing what we consider in our modern policy and diplomacy smart. In that the king was creating treaties, and through diplomacy and marriages and economic treaties was creating a system where he could rely on other kings, on other countries around him. However, this is always a point of critique from the prophets, since they have the task of prophesying God. And so Isaiah says that only God is a reliable partner, not other kings from different countries. And in Isaiah chapter 7, in verse 9, we read, "If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all." So it's basically a reminder of the prophet Isaiah, God spoken through the prophet Isaiah to the people, that they need to be faithful. They cannot rely on other people, they just need to be faithful. So this is one of the main points where Isaiah criticizes the foreign policy. He doesn't go into much detail as the prophet Hosea that we looked at last week, and certainly doesn't have the ambition that the prophet Hosea has, but the foreign policy critique is still there. Also, there's a little bit of social critique. Again, he's not as big as the prophet Amos, but there's just a tiny hint of notion. In Isaiah 2 verse 12 we read, "For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up and high." So this day of the Lord, or often called the day of reckoning that will come, is the day of judgment. This is the day where God will punish everybody who tramples on the weak, on the oppressed, on the kids, on the widows, on foreigners, on all of these things. So it's a more generalized social critique that the prophet of first Isaiah actually has. Again, it's not as much in detail as the prophet Amos in his social critique. He doesn't go into that much detail, but there is still this notion of there will be punishment coming for the wicked, for the powerful, for the ones who do not keep track of the poor and of the widows. The most important part of the first book of prophet Isaiah, or one of the most important parts, is how he actually gets recruited. The so-called vision of the glory of God is something that shaped artists and also our thinking of how people encounter God for centuries, all the way up until the Middle Ages. It's in chapter 6, and this is how Isaiah actually gets recruited, and it tells us a lot about the prophet Isaiah. So the vision of Isaiah in chapter 6. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, each had 6 wings. With two they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots of the threshold shook at the voices of those called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongues. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears, and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed. This vision that the prophet Isaiah has about his recruitment is extraordinary. It shaped a lot of things. This whole idea of God wearing a long robe that fills everything. The idea that there are angels at his side with 6 wings that both cover their eyes, their feet, and are flying. It is some very vivid imagery, and there are plentiful of pictures and painters that depicted this exact scene for it. The main point the prophet Isaiah, the first prophet of Isaiah, makes during his entire time of prophesying, and we heard it a little bit in his vision, is that there is no turning back. There is no redemption. Because it is not Isaiah himself that is invoking the hardness, but instead his prophecy showing it. We heard the task of God. They shall not see, they shall not hear, they shall not understand. So there is a problem in this, that the vision that Isaiah sees and the prophecy that actually follows doesn't change anything in the minds of people, since they cannot understand. There is a logic to this entire vision that goes downhill through the text and through what we have. So God is holy. We have this. The holy, holy, holy that we sing before communion in our church is actually worded after this scene. So holy, 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 Lord of hosts. This is what the angels sing. So I make it clear that God alone is holy and Isaiah is the sinful one. He has to be cleansed first. He is made clean through touching of the live coal that comes from the altar onto the tongue. Only then, after this sin has been blotted out, as it said in the vision, Isaiah has the ability to prophesy for God. And now the hardness of the people will remain. So this hardness is already there. It's not that God creates the hardness or Isaiah creates the hardness. It will just be shown through the prophecy of Isaiah, because the people will not listen and will not understand to what the prophet Isaiah has to say to the people. This is the first prophet of Isaiah. He also is very, very important, since in chapter 7 there is the Annunciation. The prophet Isaiah, the first prophet Isaiah, writes a piece where God prophesies that there will be a virgin who will give birth to a son and who comes out of the stem of Ishmael. So this has traditionally interpreted as the first annunciation of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And we're going to take a look at this, since a lot of the parts of the book of the prophet Isaiah has been used to prophesy or to foretell the arrival of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Now to the second prophet Isaiah. Again, we can distinguish in between the chapters 40 and 55. The theming in there is really strong and the language changes significantly. Between those chapters we have a total of 6 hymns, and they are written in a song style. It is completely different than the first 39 chapters, and that's why this break is so apparent. Also what we have is a very strong theming inside of these songs. It's no longer a social critique or a critique of foreign affairs or these kind of things. Now we have a very strong theming, that the theme of God and the holiness of God's name in Adonai or Yahweh, or the tetragram as those 4 letters JHWH say. So it focuses very much on God's holiness. Also, this theme of coming home and the new blooming of nature. The grass that was without water will be green again, and it will flourish. So there's a lot of different theming. For the time, we can pretty much narrow it down between 550 and 539 before Christ. Now that's a long time apart from the first prophet of Isaiah. Probably we have between 150 and 170 years between those two parts in the one book. And that's important to keep in mind, since we see that book. So this book of the prophet Isaiah has been around for about 170 years and is now, the name of the prophet Isaiah is now reused again for a new message. And that message is very much different than the message of the first Isaiah. We know this because in 550, a king named Cyrus is reigning, and the book of the prophet Isaiah specifically mentions him. That means the book cannot be written before 550, since there was no Cyrus as a king. Also, 539, the empire of Babylon will fall. And that is something that is also mentioned in the book. So we also know that it has to happen around this time. So that's why we can say between 550 and 539 before Christ is this book written. We now, however, do not know the exact region. It is highly probable, that doesn't mean it happened, it's just highly probable that it was written in exile. As the people are still in exile in Babylon, after Babylon destroyed the temple and led the people into exile. The second book of the prophet Isaiah preaches or tells a lot about hope and homecoming. We heard the theming. God, holiness of God's name, the theme of coming home and blooming of new life. All of these are words of hope for people that have been led into slavery far away from their home country and where their temples and cities have been destroyed and where they have to combat other gods. So this entire logic in there is that there is hope within the exile. The main theology in here is creation. God created everything. That is what makes God's what makes God's name holy and what gives God's power over everything. And everything that God does is a new creation. That is a new way of thinking about it. It shows God's power that God can create everything. In the past, it was more a thinking of God created the world at one point and then let the world run its course. And if something got destroyed, well, creation was basically nullified by humans or other influences. Well, now we have a different idea. Creation is no longer dying, but it is changing in the eyes of the present and in the future. Creation is no longer a thing that is strictly living in the past, but it's influencing people right now and will continue to influence people in the future. There is the idea of what in Latin we call a creatio continua, the continuous creation, the idea that God did not only create the earth and everything that there is in 7 days, but continues to create, to give the people not only a present but also a future. This is a new line of thinking that is especially helpful for people who basically have lost everything after their temple has been destroyed. They were led out of their hometown or home country, are in a foreign country and are slaves. So this word, this hope of a new creation, of a continuous creation, is especially powerful to people who have lost their own original creation. And again, this is much like the prophet Hosea. There is this idea of a new exodus. So the first exodus, the first leading the people into freedom out of Egypt from the slavery of Moses, when they first came into the land of Israel, well, that exodus has failed. And it has failed because of the sins of the people. That's why the temple got destroyed and why the people are now in Babylon. Well, now we have a new exodus after the the empire of Babylon fails and is ultimately destroyed. The people will go back to their home country of Israel in Jerusalem and Judah and Palestine. So now what we have is that there is a new exodus, a new time that the people are being led from slavery into freedom. And that is the new hope that is then continuing for the people. In the second book of Isaiah, we have a very important figure, the Kyros figure. The Kyros figure is the idea of Kyros, means translated anointed by God, and it has been traditionally interpreted by us Christians to point to Jesus himself. In Isaiah 45, we have this in chapter 1. Where God says or proclaims through the prophet Isaiah, through the second prophet Isaiah, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him and strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him, and the gates shall not be closed." This is the traditional interpretation of the coming of this Kyros, of this king, of this new one that has been anointed by God. In the aftermath of Jesus Christ, it has often been interpreted as Jesus. However, originally, in the time of the prophet Isaiah, the second prophet, this Kyros was probably not meant to be the Messiah. This is something that happens way later when the people want this new Messiah figure in their life. This is more a king that's promised, one like the good old King David or Saul or Solomon, one that is of God's grace and a tool of God for a just kingdom, a kingdom where all of the former mentioned criticism is no longer there. So a new hope of a new powerful king, and we can see why, since the old king, David, fell out of grace. The other kings were severely defeated by Babylon and the people were led into exile. Well, now we have the idea of a new king, a strong king, a king that is actually sent by God himself, and therefore will be a powerful king that nobody can stop. This is the original meaning of this Kyros figure. It is important to understand that this Kairos is clearly a title for a worldly king that does rule according to God's rule and for the people of God. We have a lot of these prophecies throughout the time in history. What the really new part in this is, in the second prophet, in the second book of the prophet Isaiah, it can be a foreigner. This king can come from anywhere. He just needs to be appointed by God. And that is a very new idea. Beforehand, we always had this prophecy that the new king has to be somebody from the stem of David, from another powerful tribe. But now we have this idea that this king can come from somebody new, or from a foreign power. Again, later on, it has been generally interpreted as Jesus, but then comes a whole Messiah interpretation to it. So it's not longer a worldly king, but a king of heaven and of earth. And this is then the Jesus mythology that comes into this. For the third prophet of Isaiah, we have again another break. After these 6 hymns are basically done, we have another break and we have another different theme. So it's another break in the book, and that's why we usually think that there is a third Isaiah, a third book in there. It can be seen as an interpretation of the chapters 40 to 55, so basically like a commentary. So it is clear that the third, or the writers of the third book, they knew the second book at least, and probably the first one as well, but for sure the second book, because a lot that is written in the chapters 56 to 66 points directly to the chapters 40 and 55, so directly to the aforementioned. The style of writing is different, and it goes until the end. It is more a commentary on this. The core part of this are the chapters 60 and 62, which are mainly words of grace, words of hope again for Jerusalem. We see the big difference than the start of the book of the prophet Isaiah, where we had the accusations and the condemnation of Jerusalem and Judah. Now we have the words of grace. So something has to have happened in between. And in this time, we know it's just a long time that has been in there. From the origin, based on the language and style of writing, we are pretty sure that we can pinpoint the location to Palestine. And we are also relatively sure, because there is a hint of the rebuilding of the new temple, which happens 515 before Christ. So we are relatively sure that this part of the book has to be written around this time, which means that this is much closer to the second book than the second book is to the first book. Again, as a short reminder, between the first and second book, we have around 170 years of nothing. So there's a lot of things happening in between. Now, if we point the longest period of the second book, which would mean 550 before Christ, now we have 515, which is only 45 years, or basically one generation. So it's not that far apart as the first one is. And that's why it's much closer, the third book is much closer to the second book than to the first one itself. However, we are back to normal, in quotations, of the critique of a prophet. It again has social critique, it has critique on other religions in there, and we're going to take a quick look at this. So in Isaiah 58, verse 3, it says, "Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day, you oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high." So again, it's critique, this time a little bit more elaborated and direct. And it's put specifically in the context of religious practice of the fasting. So fasting usually has been used as a religious means to not be focused yourself, but also to gain favor with God. If you want to ask God for his favor, you have to fast before. Well, sometimes the fast doesn't work, and God gives a clear explanation why. Because the people, if they fast, well, they oppress their workers. They only fast to quarrel, to fight. It doesn't have any honorable reasons why they actually fast. They only do it for fighting. So one thing that we see is the wicked fist, so the planning, the scheming, and oppressing their own workers. So again, it's critique on the rich and on the powerful. There's also a lot of critique on other religions. And again, if you remember in the first book where it was more on foreign policies, now we have more the running after different gods, and that comes so much after the prophet Hosea, who is about the same time frame where we heard the whole strong language. And we're going to see this here as well. So in chapter 57 in verse 3 it says, "But as for you, come here, you children of a sorceress, you offspring of an adulterer and a whore. Who are you mocking? Against whom do you open your mouth wide and stick out your tongue? Are you not children of transgression, the offspring of deceit? You that burn with lust among the oaks, the every green tree." So there's a lot of critique on different religious practices. Sorcery is something that is forbidden and punishable by death. Adultery, whoring, all these are images that are very strong, and we saw this in the prophet Hosea. God often uses through his prophet by saying, "You have been unfaithful to me." The original meaning of unfaithful. God uses a lot of language that God is going to be the bride or the bride for his people. So there is something like a religious or faithfully a marriage going on between the people of Israel and God. And this marriage, this good faith, is broken. And breaking of marriage is adultery or whoredom. So that's why this language is used. So again, it is relatively broad stroke. We don't have any other names of different gods, but it is clear that there's a lot of criticism in the third book as well. To end with this, what is really interesting, in the first book of the prophet Isaiah, we had this general critique, and there was this inevitability of the coming of the judgment. The people were made hard, or they were hard in themselves. There was no way for them to realize what they were doing. Here in the third book of the prophet Isaiah, we have a complete turnaround of this. The redemption of God is coming. The hardness of the people is gone. And there are even other people included into this redemption. It is no longer just the redemption for the people of Israel, but it's also open to all of the other peoples around the world. This is something that can be very helpful for us today, since oftentimes the book of the Old Testament speaks of God's chosen people as the people of Israel. And where are we Christians in that today who are living all across the world? Well, in the book of the prophet Isaiah, we have the answer. God himself opens it up for all people, and no longer just for the chosen people Israel, but now for the chosen people all around the world. Back then around the world, and today around the world. This inclusion is written in the book of the prophet Isaiah, in the third one, in the 60th chapter. And in the verses 1 through 3, it reads, "Arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn." This is the promise we're all included. And again, we have a different change in theming. Now we have a lot of theming of light and darkness. And darkness was something very scary, especially during the time in the desert in the ancient times. And light was something that was generally safe. Out of this, we have this other promise that points to the Messiah. Something that is written, that we read during Christmas worships, at least in Germany, and I'm relatively sure also in America as well. The people that have wandered in darkness have seen a great light. This light, of course, is the coming of Christ, of the Messiah, of the Kairos that has been promised to us in the second book and has been really fleshed out later on in history. So here we have this dichotomy of light and darkness, that there's a place of darkness, that is the place without God, and the place of light, that is the one with God. This place of light will come, as we heard in the first book, with the day of the Lord. And this one, of course, is then the birth of Jesus himself. This is a very, very quick trip through to the prophet Isaiah. You can study that book for probably years and only get to part 1, part 2, and part 3. It is very rich. We use it a lot. There are so many favorite passages in there that we use mainly for Christmas, then for the prophet and then for the coming of Jesus Christ. This is a very, very short overview and over this book of the prophet Isaiah. However, I thought I made it a little bit clear why you can even see 3 books, why the style changes so much, the message in itself, because the message has been tailored to the historical circumstances around it. Whereas first everything was prosperous and the kingdom was relatively safe, there was a lot of critique on that kingdom, that it wasn't all good. Then in exile, in the second book, we have more words of hope since everything else was destroyed. And now in the third one, we have the point towards the future of the inclusion of all of the other nations that are now coming back to Israel with economy and trade and so on. This was the book of the prophet Isaiah, one of the longest books and one that I only could take a short trip as a look over. So next week we're going to take a look at the other very influential major prophets. So what we do have, we have so-called major prophets and minor prophets. That doesn't mean that the major prophets are more important, it just means that the books are longer. We have another major prophet and one from a type of prophet that we haven't looked at so far. So next week we're going to take a look at the prophet Jeremiah. But that is going to be next week on our YouTube channel, again at 7 p.m. live or otherwise afterwards in the stream. This was our Bible study on the prophet Isaiah, all 3 books of them. I hope it was enjoyable for you. I hope you all have a great evening and a great week, and I would be delighted to see you all in person or here anytime. Until then, take care and goodbye.